I'm almost trying to manipulate my own mind of how do I make one of these facets that is not measurable, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, it's like, all right, I want to have a balance of born primitive in career, physical fitness and nutrition, and in friendship and family, right? And those are, I'm measuring myself on all three of those. Obviously friends and family, like it can't show up, but are there things you can implement that make it so you measure yourself against it and then you're happy with it? So for me, it's like, quality time. And if maybe it's measurable, like, all right, I want to have, 10 hours a week.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So for people that are wired like that, like we are, like you might almost have to manipulate your own mind into saying, okay, well, we're going to find a way to make this measurable. You're listening to the Born Primitive Podcast. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for joining us. We got a really interesting topic to talk about today. We're going to get a little bit philosophical on you guys. And this is something Tony and I were just rapping about a few days ago and thought it would be really appropriate. But the topic is talking about success and kind of the illusion that when we look at success, we tend to only think about things that are measurable and finite, right? And typically, unfortunately, that ends up being financial and career type goals. And we kind of get external validation from our peers through that. And then another idea that we want to get into on this is just the idea of success being a series of false summits, right? You're in your mind, okay, as soon as I get there, then I'll be happy. As soon as I get that nice car, then I'll be happy. As soon as I get that promotion, then I'll be happy. And you're going through your whole life, and every time you reach one of those, it's a false summit, and you realize, okay, you got a Range Rover, big deal. Are you really happy? No, you're not. It changed nothing. You got the promotion, you know what I mean? Maybe you're financially a little bit better off, but there has to be other things that contribute to the overall definition of success. Because otherwise, if you keep chasing those false summits and not kind of living in the moment and focusing on other more fulfilling aspects of what we're going to get into calling success, you're going to be 80 years old and you're going to look back and all you were doing was chasing an illusion and potentially something that was being done for the sake of being validated by your peers, which I think is incorrect. So,
yeah, and I think there it is important to call out that there's almost two different categories of success. One being the objective, which is what you're talking about now, that I think can be a trap or kind of an illusion that you chase after. Then the subjective, which is more like defined person to person, what they consider to be success based off their internal kind of dream or goals or what them and their family want to achieve. But I do think it's important to call out that like objective success is not inherently bad. That like, and not that you were saying that, but that there is a level of objective success, which I would like, let's use financial for example, is that like, you should be able to provide for your family. You should be able to eat the foods you want and travel where you and your family want. And of course that doesn't happen. You can't just flick your fingers and that happens. But to me, it's mapping out and balancing the two, the subjective and the objective, so that like you said, you're not only focusing on the financial success and then you end up 60 years in and you don't talk to your kids, your relationship has melted. That's where that starts to get out of balance. And for me, what the root of making sure you stay aligned on that is mapping out your dream in alignment with your loved ones in a way that you kind of have a goalpost or a North Star that you guys are working towards. Because without that, it's so easy to leverage into those other spaces, because like you said, you get that feedback from people around you, that little ego boost of like, oh, you're making more money, you're able to buy more things. But like I said, those things aren't inherently bad, but without a balance of the subjective, which is more relationships, families, friendships, to balance you out. Like I do think, like you called out, that can end up leading to a tricky place down the road where you've completely forgotten about those more subtle subjective things, the relationship side of things, and you've over leveraged completely into the objective side of things.
Absolutely. And I think for the super type A people, which I think most people listening probably are, we are very vulnerable to chasing hard those measurable things, right? Because it's just how we're wired. It's the next ridgeline we're trying to get to. Me, for example, I think, unfortunately, I absolutely have fit that mold, honestly, since a young age. In the early days, it was sports and academics. Like I wanted to, play Division I football and go to an Ivy League school. And from that, I knew I had to live in the weight room, live in the books, practice hard, etc. That was the first goal. And I was obsessed with it. That's all I cared about. You know what I mean? It wasn't to say I wasn't present with my family, but that was all that mattered for 5 years of my life. Okay, now you get there. Okay, cool. What's the next one? All right, now you're, trying to get, to the CrossFit games. So you're training 5 hours a day, going to bed at 8:30, this, and this. And now you're obsessed with that. That's the next goal. And then it, shifted for the military thing for me. So I was, training 5 hours a day, getting up early, going to the pool, doing all this, trying to get ready for the military. Okay, that's the next goal. Now we're launching Born Primitive. Now there's sales goals every year you're trying to reach. You're always chasing these things, and you're so obsessed with it that you potentially neglect other aspects of your life, and you don't even realize it because you're so damn competitive. And I think for a lot listening, like we gotta reflect on that a little bit. And this is actually kind of came up as I was talking in therapy. It kind of came up as like, all right, I'm 35 years old. A lot of people externally might be like, oh, well, Bear's doing really well. But I'm to the point now where I have to maybe take the foot off the gas a little bit because there's other things that I need to balance out. And it won't show up on the stat sheet. And I think that's for people like us, that's the biggest vulnerability. If I leave work and spend 3 quality hours with my daughter, like at the beach and, doing things at the house and painting and stuff, before she goes to bed, that doesn't show up on the stat sheet anywhere. You know what I mean? No one's been, oh, Bear's killing it. And no one's going to see that. You know what I mean? It doesn't affect my bank account. It doesn't affect my career status. But those are things we now have to consider. So I guess what I'm getting at is we need to redefine what success is, and that might change in different phases of your life.
100%. And that's why like that sentence I said of like mapping out the important part of that statement of what I think success or what success could look like is being aligned with your loved ones. Like if your definition of success is only based around your interpretation of it, you're going to leave collateral damage all around you. Whereas like when you're in alignment with the people around you and you're all kind of rowing in the same direction, hard shit makes sense then. Like you can still go through very hard things, but you can look at each other in the eyes and say like, hey, I got you. Whereas if you're off on your own little crusade and it's not aligned with the loved ones around you, eventually they're going to be like, hey dude, like this isn't, you're what are you chasing? Like we're sitting here while you chase these kind of false summits, as you called them. And the most valuable thing you could bring to us is your time and your love. And that sounds cliche, but to me too, it's like almost two different energies. You have like your mind, and the mind always wants more. The mind wants to accomplish, it wants more material success and here's the cliche kind of woo-woo part is your heart is different. Like that whole energy is different. And that's like you said, it's not as measurable, but there's a feeling there, like a presence and an overwhelming, like just sense of like, being in the moment with your loved ones. And to me, that is equally as important. And it's so hard though, because that one, the timetable for that is less instant gratification, where the mind, you can work and see success very quickly. And you can see projects you're working on and financial success, material success. Those heart ones, man, like those take time. And for me, it's like a big thought now that I have a daughter is, I want to be 18 and be able to like hug her and her look at me and feel open enough to like talk about the shit that's going on in her life. Because I know my experience and then a lot of my friends, it's like your parents, you build up this weird relationship due to some of the things we're talking about. They weren't there. Maybe they didn't have the time because they were working on their career. You get the 18, man, and like I'm not having deep conversations with my parents or like my friends aren't. So to me, there's a more of a heartfelt one of like, when I'm 18, I want to be able to look at my daughter in the eyes and her be able to open up to me about what's going on in her life and me be able to give maybe not even advice, but just be there for her in a way that she's like, hey, I lean on my dad, as opposed to just like, yeah, my dad and I, like we say hi, we hang out for Christmas and Thanksgiving, and then that's about it. And like those things, what I was kind of getting at there is the mind loves those instant successes. The heart, that heart energy is kind of like a long-term, like, hey, this is a slow play, but it is equally as important as those kind of more measurable, objective things.
Yeah, 100%. And it's like we said, that's the hardest part. It's because it's not measurable, right? It doesn't show up on a number on a bank account, right?
It shows up when you die. That's the tricky part. Is I do think when you're about to die, you're going to look back and it's not going to be the money you made. I think you'll be proud of those things, but it really is. And that's where when you talk to older people, which can be powerful at times, it's like, that's the shit that matters, man. Those relationships, like that time back with your kids, like that regret, if you're feeling that on your fucking deathbed, that stings. Whereas like that extra $100,000 in your bank account, you're not going to give a fuck when you're dying. But that time you didn't spend with your daughter, I have a feeling, man, that regret's heavy.
100%. And I think it's, for me, I'm almost trying to manipulate my own mind of how do I make one of these facets that is not measurable, right? So for me, it's like, all right, I want to have a balance of born primitive in career, physical fitness and nutrition, and in friendship and family, right? And those are, I'm measuring myself on all three of those. Obviously friends and family, like it can't show up, but are there things you can implement that make it so you measure yourself against it and then you're happy with it? So for me, it's like, quality time. And if maybe it's measurable, like, all right, I want to have, 10 hours a week.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So for people that are wired like that, like we are, like you might almost have to manipulate your own mind into saying, okay, well, we're going to find a way to make this measurable.
Well, and if you do that, like anything, if you do that long enough, like maybe you have to start doing that way, but then over time, like anything, it becomes more of a muscle where you feel that connection without having to map out how many hours you're going to do it, because it's become part of your routine. Whereas like it's easy. And I know, like, even think about trying to shift from this workplace, how like we grind here, we're like 8, 9, 10 hours, then going home. That's a great example of the difference between those energies. Is like, you show up, man, it is hard to shut off at times. And I know you can relate to that. Like after coming out of here, you're in 6 hours worth of meetings, you get 74 Slack messages, you have 20 text messages you haven't answered. Then you get home and you're trying to feed your kid on their high chair. And it's like, you have to slow down so much because, and here's where like, here's the check-in I have to do with myself. How many times, and of course I don't have a ton of experience to speak to this, but in my 15 months with a daughter, I can count a ton of times where I spend 10 minutes with her and I'm like, I was not there during that 10 minutes. And that's what's scary to me, because if you scale that out over time, like it's easy in the moment to be like, oh, well, I was busy today and like I had a lot of shit going on, like screw it, it's not that big of a deal. But guess what? Like I guarantee if a lot of 60-year-olds who have kind of grinded and been super successful, if you get them to be vulnerable, they're going to say that is that like, yes, check in, do your best to avoid those moments, because those start to add up over time. And then, like I mentioned earlier, I think that can create a disconnect between you and that loved one, that like, it wasn't one cut, it was 1,000 cuts over 18 years that added up to them feeling like, yeah, my dad's here, but he's not really here.
Totally. And I think it's, to kind of look at the other side of the coin, you and I are obviously alluding to a theme of like, hey, focus on family. Don't neglect those things because, well, that's not measurable. Like it's fucking important. However, and we talked about this, off cameras, like there is a time to over index and to get the fuck after it for the sake of your family. Right. In a career stage. So I don't want to give the impression, because that's the last thing I'm trying to say is like, hey, if you're on the road or you're working a super long work week, or you're trying to get that next rung on the ladder, if there's a calculated reason and it's going to create opportunity for your family, go after it. And I was listening to an interesting podcast about, it was a CEO, I can't remember who it was. And this is kind of what kind of sprung this thought for me. And it made me think a lot, is he had realized, similar to me, that he was chasing success for his business maybe a little too much, and it had taken over his life, and he was just relentlessly competitive, and that's all that mattered. And it worked. I mean, he built a $100 million business. He was killing it. It was profitable. But he was kind of, realizing he didn't feel like he had a true sense of purpose outside of that, even though he had a family. So what he did is he tried to scale it way back. He started working like, 5-hour work days, 4 days a week, and this and that. And he was trying to kind of gain some equity back on the family side. What happened in the process was the business started to slip, because it was still at a phase where he needed to really be present, to be pulling strings in the background and making sure everything was working right. And so he overcorrected, right? And the business started to slip. So then he ended up having a conversation with his dad of like, hey, what do I do? I'm in this limbo. If I don't focus on the business, it slips. But if I do, then I'm not at home, blah, 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 blah. And his dad ended up telling him, hey, for 5 years of your life, I made a calculated decision to over-index on work for the sake of you. He's like, you were from the day you were born to, sometime around 5 years old, I was on the road all the time, 200 days out of the year. He said that was a calculated decision because I knew it would create opportunity for you in the later half of your life. And he's like, guess what? You don't even remember that, do you? And he's like, no, I don't. And he's like, exactly. And he said, it was hard for me to do that, packing bags every Sunday night and coming back Thursday nights. And I think he was a consultant, so he's on the road a lot. But I thought that was a really cool example that his dad basically told him, hey, there is a time and a place to over-index, you know what I mean, on one specific area, because in the greater good, it will produce more benefit. But obviously, as we know, it can be a trap, because then maybe it's a few years, and then before you know it, it's 10 years, and now you don't know your kids, right? So I just want to call that out, because I don't want to give the impression that, hey, just, leave at 3:30 every day, and then don't check your Slack messages or email ever at night, this and that, because there might be some people that are scrapping. They might now start, passing you, right, in the career trajectory, and maybe that, that prevents you from some cool opportunities that might have really helped your family. And so I think it is that balance. It's an impossible question, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, and that's the gray area that's for each individual to navigate, because you're right. Like, to me, it leads back to the alignment part is, as long as to play that out in a shitty scenario is, you convince yourself you're doing it for your kid. 5 years down the road, you get a divorce because your partner's like, hey, you did nothing but work for 5 years. So they're 100%, as long as you're aligned with your loved ones, you should be able to have those conversations of like, hey, I'm going to lean the fuck in for 5 years, work my ass off. Here's the end state, because and that end state doesn't need to be an end state as far as like, oh, we're done at, like, oh, we've reached the pinnacle of success. It's more just like, hey, maybe here's the freedoms that I want to create for us and our family over those 5 years. And as long as you and your partner, even your friends, all look at that and say like, yeah, that's worth it, then you're in alignment, so that you don't cause a wreckage throughout there, and you get to that year 5. And like I said, you and your spouse have moved apart. You get a divorce because you told yourself you were doing it for the family, but you ruined your family in the midst of it. So there's that subtlety. And that's why I think the alignment is so important, is because it's easy to convince yourself you're doing it for the right reasons, but you need to get at least some feedback from the people you love that that's true, so that you're not just convincing yourself of something almost as an addiction to like continue to chase it. But I agree with you 100%. And that's like, this message should not come through as like, guys, focus only on family, the rest will take care of itself. It's like, no, there is a very important, like we kicked off with, an objective measure where you need to be, especially if you're the sole provider, or even if not, that like, you need to be providing some objective, like foundational stability for you and your family. And let's be honest, a lot of times there's a financial component to that. So being able to lean into that and provide your kids the food, the schooling, those other things that are important for them growing up is equally as important as finding that balance. So yeah, definitely not should be taken as if that those things don't matter and it's all honky dory as long as you and your family are happy, because it's not as simple as that.
Well, I smirked a little bit while you were saying that, because you talk about divorce, right? And it's like, and we'll get into another episode that I think you guys are really like. We're going to get into the backstory of the brand, and we'll probably break it in a few episodes. But, as some of you might know, maybe not know, me and the co-founder Mallory were married, right? We started this together, and she's wired just like I am, which a big reason why it's successful.
Great for
right?
a business,
we're in a way, like when it comes to this, we're fucking savages. Like in the early days, we're on the road, this and that. I mean, we'll get into that, but we were type A, we were relentless, and we were going to make this work, and no one was going to stop us. We weren't getting funded by private equity companies. We bootstrapped the whole thing. We were just scrappy and getting after it. As a married couple and trying to, pursue that while also just being married, it's impossible, because any free hour of the day, we were both on doing Born Primitive. You know what I mean? And we were aligned on that. Like, it wasn't even discussed. Like, that's obvious, So 8:00 at night, we're both on our laptops in the couch, with the TV on, running, paying attention. And hey, did you get that email from this supplier? And hey, what are we gonna do about this? And it's 11:00 at night. You've just worked for 3 or 4 hours after, and I was active duty. So for me, it was always after hours. And before you know it, it's been 5 years and all you've worked on is the business. So example, a measurable success, because, oh, Born Primitive, cool. Like, look at what they built, right? So external validation, but internally that was wildly imbalanced. And I remember, just an extreme example. We went out to Hawaii for like, what was the first vacation in 5 years. And I think it's 5 hours behind over there.
Yeah.
So we made the decision, we'll get up at 4 every morning and work until noon, because that would cover the workday for our employees here on the East Coast. Right. So we get up at 4 in the morning and we'd be in our the condo until noon, just working on the computer. Right. And then noon would come, like, all right, now we can go start our vacation day. You know what I mean? But you're going to bed at like 7:30 because you're getting up at 4. You know what I mean? So even on vacation, it was like, it wasn't even, we were both like, yep, of course, get up at 4, got it. Sounds good, we'll do it. And then we could stay ahead. There was no ever like unplug. When we should have just been like, hey, work can wait 5 days. Let's go, climb a waterfall or something. You know what I mean? So even in those moments, so I guess I'm using a real life example that yes, it can produce collateral damage in your life. And then what was it all for? You know what I mean? You got to think about that.
Well, and there's a question that probably doesn't have an answer. It's more of a philosophical question, is like, would Born Primitive be the way it is today and the successes it's had if you guys hadn't done that? Is that, like, in your opinion, is that possible?
No, fuck no.
So
that's what it took.
And there's what it relates to is like, and you said it right at the kickoff of this podcast, is having the wisdom to identify when moments in life you should over leverage into things. Now, once again, there should always be alignment there, but like what you just said, like this, everything around us, this podcast wouldn't exist if you hadn't done that. Now, I think from you, at least what I hear is that there are learnings now. If you were to do this all over, you would find ways maybe to stay more aligned throughout that process. But that fucking hard work, that leaning super into what you were doing and grinding your ass off, like that created this. So in a way, that is in my point, or not even my point, but just what sparked in my head is that the ability to identify those moments when you need to lean in, you got to be able to do that, because there's going to be moments like that.
Yeah, no, it's true, because it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly.
Because 100%, if we didn't do that, if we weren't that nuts and obsessed, none of this shit exists.
Yeah.
Because there was a 4 or 5 year period where it was just me and her, right? And, it was took over the house, it was our lives, that was it. So maybe flawed from one approach, but if you want to do something exceptional, it takes exceptional effort. You know what I mean? Like you can't, otherwise everyone would be doing that shit.
Did you feel, and maybe this is something we could maybe dive in more when Mal's on here, but did you kind of feel that pull that like, this isn't sustainable, as far as the relationship side? Like, cause I've worked alongside you guys long enough to know how passionate you are about this. So that I know was probably natural, like not even natural, just you guys had probably picked up some momentum and you were pulling at that thread, and I know both your personalities. So I could see you chasing that, but would you say either of you started to feel that like, oh shit, like we're running so hard on this, but our relationship is starting to kind of take a back seat?
Me personally, no, just because again, we were so damn competitive. We were just hyper focused on the goal. You know what I mean? And that's all that mattered. You know what I mean? We're just chasing it, head down, going. I don't think there was ever like a reflective thought of like, hey man, maybe I should consider like the implications of my long-term family life.
Yeah.
Especially like, it's almost been 10 years. So when you're in your mid to late 20s, not to say I'm some like, wisdom filled guy. Now I'm 35, but you fuck some shit up and you learn the hard way. And now at least maybe I'm, not acting on it, but at least I'm self-aware that, hey, if this happens again, and I end up getting married to somebody else, like I want to be cognizant of that. You know what I mean? But in the moment, no, we were just getting after it. It was just, work. That's all that mattered. And like I said, even on vacation, it was like, hey, when are we going to work?
And what you just said is an interesting part of like, even you and I, like you and I's dynamic is that what I respect a lot about you is that you're really good at things I'm not good at. And I think my brain thinks different than you. And I'll break that down, is that like, you're so good. First off, your ability to handle risk is bar none. Like I've met very few people that are willing to take risks like you. And then also your ability to like hyper focus on something and then at like just fucking 100% run towards it is something I've learned a lot from and really respect, because I'm a little bit different. I think you probably would agree with this, is that like where you said, no, I wasn't really thinking of like the lateral effects. I was just focused on what I was doing. For some reason, and there's pros and cons to this, I'm thinking about 100 things at all times on every decision I make. So a little like what it relates to like what you're good at and maybe I'm not as good at is like maybe the risk taking. And that's something filling into my role now, you kind of learn, hey, this has got to be something you're willing to do at times. But yeah, that it's funny to see the difference there, because I asked you that question for that reason, to kind of dig in, because I've noticed you and I are very different in that, where I'm thinking through overthinking things through 100 different lenses. You're very good at like focusing and then being willing to take risks to achieve that kind of at all costs, which once again, that has its pros and cons as well.
Absolutely. And to use like a ridiculous analogy for, I think, summarizing that phase of my life in Mallory as well, it's like, if you ever been like wrestling with your buddies in the pool growing up and like guy kind of holds you under down at like the deep end, right? And you're trying to, and you realize all of a sudden you're out of air and you just turn into an absolute mutant and you just start clawing and ripping.
You're biting.
And you literally will do anything because you have to breathe. It becomes instinctive.
Yeah.
Like I hate to say, it sounds like a ridiculous analogy to make, but in those early years, that was almost the mindset, right? Like you will literally do anything to succeed and whatever it takes. You're clawing, you're pulling air, So that was it. And we were both in that mindset. And obviously we made it to the surface. We got air, but there were consequences on the way to the top. You know what I mean? So
that's a good, I like that. I like that. That's a relatable one, especially if you have a big brother.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we both do.
Yeah.
So getting our ass kicked in the pool and, you're getting dunked. So,
and do you like, question that pops up for me there, and it relates to what you said earlier. Did you feel a sense of false summits throughout that process where like during that grind phase, say at the, I don't know, at the 5 million mark or the 10 million mark, did you feel like, oh, if we can just get to here, things will be okay? Whereas now you'll probably laugh at that because each level up comes with its own unique set of problems. But I guess the question is, did you kind of feel those false summits where like, fuck, I convinced myself that if we just made it to here, we'd be okay. And then we got to here and I realized, oh, this is just a whole new problem set to solve.
Totally. And at the sermon at church on Sunday, the Pastor T, if you're listening, shout out to you. He was talking about this and it made me reflect even more. Cause I'm like kind of, I'm realizing this kind of almost in real time as we're talking about it, but yeah, 100% because, and that's the illusion, right? It's like, all right, if we double next year, then we've made it. And next year comes and goes and you hit your goal and you don't even sit back and acknowledge your handiwork. It's immediately on to, okay, let's double it again. Right. And I remember, we hit the 100 million mark. Right. And I think I just texted Mal and I was like, hey, heads up. I just ran the numbers and like, that's kind of cool. You know what I mean? And then I think like within 20 seconds, we're like talking about another problem, that we're like solving for the next day. You know what I mean? It wasn't like, oh shit, like let's celebrate like this huge milestone. It was like, it wasn't even, we didn't give it more than 30 seconds of thought and it's immediately on to the next goal. Right. And that's completely like effed. You know what I mean? Like the fact that, so I think in this case, it is 100% measurable. And even when it's measurable and you achieve it, as soon as you get to that, again, it's a false summit. You think you're at the top, you get there and then you see another peak way up there and you go, damn, I thought this was the top. We got another, we got to throw the rucksack back on and start climbing again.
When you can, and I know you can relate to this, is that some like more seasoned business people, let's say 60-year-olds who've kind of been in the game for a while, I never understood, like a lot of them will map out, say they're starting a new venture, a new business, like they will map out their exit from the start. And that seems like so silly to me. And even to you, like you can relate to this way better than I can as a founder. But now I start to see maybe why, like if they've bought and sold 6 companies, it's almost for that reason is that like, hey, more isn't more. If I keep chasing, if we get to 20 million revenue, maybe at an 80 million evaluation, it's like, I'm getting out no matter how much I love what I'm doing. And of course that's probably a generalization, but because I'm sure people do stay in longer than maybe they initially intended. It's like, I can see why they would do that because that's like the false summit thing is like, no, I'm going to map out exactly what my goal is here. And then when I hit that, I'm done. I'm starting something else that I map out another vision for, because there isn't, if you don't have that end state to start, you're going to learn a ton through the way, but you may end up at a point where you throw your hands up and you're like, fuck, like, where is this going? Do you know what I mean? And that's for each individual. And like, I can't even speak to that from experience other than being alongside you guys on this journey. But that is an interesting thing you start to see with like more seasoned guys is that, hey, maybe you do define that right away from the beginning so that you don't end up kind of throwing your hands up like, well, it's great, we achieved all these things, but I don't even really know where we ended up.
Yeah, I think on this one, it's my thoughts have changed quite a bit over the 10 years, but you got to think in the beginning, dude, there was no plan. We were just walking up to the tree line, with rucksacks on, like, all right, fuck it. Should we just walk straight and see where it goes? You know what I mean? Like there was no path, there was no journey charted out, and we just kind of figured it out along the way. Now that we've been in the game, for a minute, and I think a lot of founders can relate to this, and people that run their own businesses is eventually you start thinking, okay, like what is all this for? And because it takes so much work as a founder, and like you sacrifice other aspects of your life, as we've kind of alluded to, for the sake of building something. And eventually you realize, hey, all of this work, like, what is it for? For me though, one kind of caveat to that is it can't all be financially driven. Cause for me, I get tremendous satisfaction and fulfillment out of like the fact that we employ like 75 people in healthcare and the payroll and the benefits and, medical and 401ks and all that. Like, to me, that's a really cool thing to be proud of. And if you just, if the only game is an eventual exit, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of founders that is literally the only plan and it's all they care about. And there's a pathway to get there. But for me, it's become more than that, because the exit was never the intent in the beginning. And now that we have all these people and like, we got a good vibe here and it's fun, it's like, I don't know the hell else I would do. You know what I mean? So I'm kind of in this tug of war in my head of like, man, it would really be nice to be able to kind of like step back a little bit and bring in some partners. And maybe I'm still obviously very active, but maybe a little bit of that burden isn't all on, and of course it isn't, like everyone here shares the burden, but as the ultimate decision maker, as CEO and COO, as Mal and I, like the heavy and the hard decisions land at our desk because we're kind of the ones steering the ship in the right direction. Yeah. And as our headcount grows, that burden gets heavier and heavier because you're realizing, hey, if you make a couple of wrong decisions, maybe that might affect the people that you employ, right? So it's this greater responsibility, and a lot of y'all will never see that because the door's closed and it's closed door conversation type stuff. Yeah. So
and I could even caveat myself in what I just said and almost disagree with the sense that like having that plan in place from the start, I think would negate some of the passion and just like pure fucking grit that you and Mal had as well. Do you know what I mean? Whereas like if you have that mapped out, it's like you may not have that aggression because you have an end state already. Whereas you guys, it was like almost survival mode. And I mean that as a pro in this instance of like, you guys were just fucking hustling. Do you know what I mean? And it was like a grittiness that like, if you have everything mapped out and you know exactly how it's going to go, it's like that passion may not be there. Whereas you guys, it's like, no, we're going to make this work. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic there.
Yeah. And I think if you're sitting here listening, hopefully one of the takeaways from this is sit back and where you are in your life right now and reflect on what are the things that you want to be, that kind of encompass success. And I think you and I both agree you need to try to incorporate more things that are just measurable. But like we said, if you are not married and you don't have kids and you're 26 and you want to be X, now is the time to over-index, hyper-focus, and you know what I mean? And go dark for a couple years and get the fuck after it. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing wrong with that because once you have the kid, once you're married, like the game changes. Like let's just call it out, right? Like you have to, unless you're just completely going to neglect both of those things, then, of course that will show its ugly face in other ways. But if you're listening and you're, 28, 30, what I guess it can be any age, and you have that freedom of movement, now is the time. Take advantage of it. Or if you're 18 and you want to be a college football player and do this and that, join the military, whatever it is, now is the time. Do it. If you find yourself in a slightly more complicated situation in, a little bit later in your life and you got family members and this and that, it becomes a bit more nuanced. And as we said, it still does not mean you can't pursue that relentlessly and potentially over-index. But I think you do have to reflect on how am I balancing my family and the other, and another one's physical fitness. You know what I mean? Like these people, some of my college buddies, these are Division I middle linebackers. These guys were absolute monsters. You know what I mean? Physical specimens. Like you wouldn't mess with these dudes bumping into them at a bar, right? These are the guys that I played with. And I hate to say it, I run into some of these guys now. We're in our mid-30s. And I'm like, you better not be telling people you were a Yale football middle linebacker. You know what I mean? You better be telling them you were like the kicker. You know what I mean? And because, they're working on Wall Street, they're making hundreds of thousands of dollars, but now they look like they can't fight their way out of a freaking paper bag. You know what I mean? So I think it's, sit back. Okay, what do you want to balance? I think fitness and nutrition is important. I think family and friends is important. And then you have career. And come up with a plan to make sure that you're giving all of those things in your life the amount that they deserve. And of course, like family should get more than probably fitness, right? Maybe you don't spend 3 hours. You know what I mean? And those are sacrifices we make. Yeah. I know you and I, we get in the gym and it's like, I can't really warm up anymore. You got to go. You know what I mean? Because I can't do the 2-hour workouts I used to do, right? When I didn't have a kid and all that, you know what I mean? So it's going to be a balance. But I do think it's a constant evolution, and we need to constantly be thinking about it. And hopefully you do that through therapy with your friends and family. You know, keep people kind of keeping you honest on that, and something when you're drinking your morning coffee, think about it. You know what I mean? And how are you stacking up, and are you actually making progress towards that kind of rebalance, or not?
Yeah, I think that's what you just said is a great call out for mapping out your dream. Is like, hey, it's not when I say, hey, map out a dream that aligns with you and your loved ones. That's not just career, and that's not just relationship. Like a huge part of it, and I know you feel the same way, is exactly what you said, is like, to me, that's food and movement too. Like those are huge components for you being able to show up at your career and also for your family in a way that is kind of like, kind of a clean energy is what I call it. Is like, if you're not doing those two things, like even with the most focus in the world, you're missing what I think is a large piece of just, like I said, being able to show up for your family, being able to show up in your career in an energized state. So yeah, that's like the takeaway for me is get as clear as possible on that maybe mission statement for you and your loved ones for your life. And that sounds corny, and I know it's hard to sit down and write that shit out, but like write that and then get super detailed on how you want to be eating, how much you want to move. And like you said, that's a balance. Like you got to balance all these variables, get really clear and aligned with your loved ones and your friends and family. And if you're able to map that out, that becomes your compass for your life. And that makes decisions easier. That makes end states make sense. Is if you had a guide to get there, you're not going to reach those false summits and say, ugh, like this didn't bring me any fulfillment. It's like, if you're very clear on your values and what you want to achieve for yourself and your family, and what you want to do working out and how you want to eat, it's like it makes decisions and it makes the grind make more sense, because you know, like, hey, this came from my soul. This isn't, I'm not just neurotically creating things with no intention behind it. And that's empowering for individuals. And I know for myself, like that's where you feel in tune with your reality. And you kind of, to me, it's that flow state of like, you're creating, and it's not just from a place that you don't understand. You're creating because you fucking mapped it out and you aligned with people on it. And then the people around you start to see you doing that too. And it's like, then not only are you're building a strong community, but you become of value to them because you're helping shape the environment you're all participating in.
Totally. And I think the last kind of point I want to extract is for anyone listening, and I'm absolutely guilty of this, and you probably are too, is we have to force ourselves to appreciate some of the success along the way, right? If it's that, like, I know we're hitting that false summit analogy, but imagine, you're rucking up a mountain, you think it's the summit, you get there, and then you see another summit right up, even higher, so you throw your rucksack back on and you keep going. All right. In that moment, maybe we take a break. We look back behind us and we see that beautiful valley that we just came up, and you know what I mean? And we hydrate.
Yep.
We eat a
beer.
Yeah, maybe a beer we smuggled in, right? A protein bar.
Yeah.
We sit on a log, chill for a little bit. We talk, you know what I mean? And then it's like, hey, you all ready to roll again? Like, let's hit this. But we took a moment to reflect, and hey, while we're not to the top yet, that was a good effort, and we can appreciate this. And I'm so guilty of that, man. I mean, I literally have not done that once. You know what I mean? Am I proud of some of the things I've done? Yes. But I don't think I've given 2 seconds of thought of, oh man, like I really killed that. Like, look at me. Let me pat myself on the back. This is really cool. Now, you don't want to do that, but at the same time, celebrate the victories along the way, and take a pause and you live in that moment a little bit. And then when you feel like, all right, you're good, you've appreciated, all right, now let's get to the next ridgeline. But man, that's something I'm still working on, man.
Couldn't agree more.
All right. Well, we appreciate y'all listening. Would love to hear your thoughts. So if you guys have comments on this, or honestly ways you've been able to kind of wrap your head around this, we would love to hear from you. So please comment for the podcast. Please subscribe, like, all those things you can do. That really helps us out, particularly in the early stages of this podcast. And another thing we're going to be doing some Q&A. So we really want to hear from you guys. Obviously Tony and I are by no means experts, but we'd love to get any of your questions or any topics you want us to kind of, ponder on. And, we're going to get a lot of cool guests in, so we can also punt a lot of those questions to them if we feel like they're a, better, more appropriate person to answer that. So let us know what you want us to talk about. We hope this, at the very least, gives you something to think about today on what success looks like, and the fact that only, it's not just the measurable things that matter, and particularly finances and career. Like don't fall into that trap. You don't need to be externally validated by social media and the other people in your life. There's so much more to it. So define what that is for you, put together a plan to execute, and then hold yourself accountable to that effort.
Love it.
All right. Thanks everybody.
Guys.